had rebuilt. And Japan and Europe understood real well that in a world dominated by the United States, if you're going to rebuild your economy from war, you better focus on doing what those Americans do, since they control everything, by either making it better or making it cheaper. And they went to work to do that, which is why you drive a Toyota. They figured out how to do it. Their life depended on it. If they didn't outdo the United States, they couldn't have a capitalist industry in these countries, so they did. And American companies began to discover real competition. Now, you know, all of our business leaders talk about the importance of competition. It's the last thing they want. They hate it. Every day I work with boards of directors. I can assure you half of what they do is to avoid, evade, and crush competition wherever it rears its ugly head. They pay specialists to go out and talk about it, but they hate it. Academics celebrate it. So what did American industry do? In order to compete better, they decided a key thing is to lower wages. That way, even if they couldn't make the stuff better, they could make it cheaper. And you all know what they did. In the 1970s, the American industry began a process that was called the export of capital, more recently called outsourcing, just moving production to where the workers are cheap, leaving the United States, emptying out. Many of you ever traveled to the cities across New England? You know what I mean. Those brick buildings, 3 or 4 stories high, running a block long, in which, 12 sculptors work. Finished, dead, gone. The second thing, and then that lowered wages because the jobs were going out, leaving behind people without jobs, who, in order to get a job, would have to offer themselves for less than other people were getting as they began to compete for jobs. The second thing that began in a big way in the 1970s was the pressure of business, who didn't want to go abroad to have cheap workers, to do it the better way. Bring the cheap workers here. Immigration, take off. We bring a vast array of people from every corner of the world, with particular emphasis on Central America, which is why every restaurant in New York City is brought to you by Mexican people. And they came in and they're willing to work real cheap, because half of them will be thrown out of the country if their employer rats them out, which they understand, and so they work for very little. We also had another phenomenon. The computerization of every kind of production made workers redundant, threw workers out, made workers unnecessary. You put all those things together, and you add a few more, which I don't have time to go into, but we can in the question, and the wages stopped rising. Wages flattened out. Okay, you don't need an advanced degree here to understand. If the amount of stuff each worker produces, and therefore his employer has more and more to sell per worker, goes up, but what you pay the worker doesn't, that's called profit. That difference there between what the worker produces and what you pay him is the profit. So starting in the 1970s, the United States experienced a flattening out of wages, coupled with a continued rise of productivity, with the result that we produced in the United States the greatest boom in profits in our history. And the story begins with this unprecedented profit explosion. Who gets profits? Employers. And who shares in the profits an employer gets? The shareholders. Well, the place to be in the last 25 years, until a few weeks ago, was the stock market. Because that was how you, as an individual, participated in this boomerang. Working wouldn't get you much of that. In fact, it got you none of that. But owning shares, that's where you would be. So anybody having to do with the business of handling profits, distributing profits, getting a piece of the profits, did well. The working class did not. Now let's follow the bouncing ball. What do you think happens to a working class, like the Americans, used to, for 150 years, rising wages, which will enable rising consumption, to suddenly find themselves in a situation they didn't understand, but they knew the wages weren't going up anymore. If you measure your own success, your own worth as a person by what you consume, and you don't get the wages to pay for it, that is, the amount of money you get per hour doesn't go up, how the hell are you going to consume more? Americans did two things. The first thing American workers did to try to keep consuming more, even though their wages didn't go up, was work more hours. Statistic. Between the mid-70s and today, the average number of hours worked per year by an American worker rose about 20%. Over the same period of time, the average number of hours worked by a French, German, Italian, Swedish worker dropped by 20%. That's a stark difference. You notice it when you travel in those countries. Those people smile a lot. They stop. During the day, they have time. They drink wine. They look at the cheese. You know, and their cheese is not come in little slices between plastic. They're not in such a rush, you know. Italy is the place where the movement called, and I didn't make this up, slow food got underway as a response to the American horror of the fast food. So Americans went to work a lot. And you know, they didn't just work more hours, but they sent more members of the household out to work. Those are the 30 years in which the mass of American women that had defined themselves in terms of the home began to redefine themselves in terms of work outside the home, paid work. Retired people didn't anymore. They came back into the labor force. Young people worked. Americans worked themselves senseless. It did some terrible things. It put unbelievable psychological strains on the American family because the woman being gone, having held it emotionally together so often, was now exhausted. The woman typically had what Arlie Hochschild, the wife of the speaker the other night here, called the double shift. The woman who goes out to work a regular job, comes home, and is still the one who raises the kids, cleans the house, cooks the food, and so on. There may be a connection here between that fact and the fact that American women consume more antidepressant drugs than any other population of either gender in any country on the planet. We also have the highest divorce rate in the world. And so there may be some connection. Parents and children barely recognize each other, and when they do, cross the street to avoid one another. There may be some connection here. Our families fell apart. We began to study and to celebrate even in our media, right? The dysfunctional family, etc., etc. We worry about child abuse, sex abuse, spouse abuse, you fill in the blank. We are stressed. Was the extra work done enough to allow these workers to consume more? No. First, they discovered that if mother goes out of the house, you now have all kinds of new expenses. She has to have a proper outfit. She may have to have another car, and you start buying prepared food. Pretty soon, a large chunk of her income is eaten up by these other things. So the American working class did something else. They borrowed money like no working class in the history of this planet ever did before. From the mid-30s to the present, the American working class pioneered a level of debt, household debt, that still in most countries of the world hasn't begun to be equal. There are a few countries, though, in case any of you come from those, I want you to feel proud now. There are a few countries that have matched the American record. South Korea, Ireland, there are several. Remarkable. And they're falling apart now too quick. So Americans became indebted. And what happened in the family? Well, let's see. It's exhausted by all the work, and it freaked out with anxiety about the debt. The American family is falling apart. Keep that in mind when you see the political point I'll come to later.